Delighted to host Ravi Agrawal for his really extraordinary book, India Connected. And I'm going to let him speak to that. But how many of you in this room have a smartphone? Of course, everybody. Of course, right? But the thing about the smartphone is it's still a relatively new technology, right? I mean, the first smartphone came out in 2007. So we're talking about, it's an 11-year-old technology, and there's 3 billion of them in the world right now. 3 billion smartphones, and we're headed for 6 billion by the year 2021. 6 billion smartphones. We haven't seen that kind of rapid technological adoption. I don't know. Let's think, I mean, if you can think of something, let us know, with that kind of rapid technological adoption. And the smartphone is transforming how we live, how we consume, how we connect, and how we produce in so many different ways. And Ravi really touches on all of that and how it is transforming India. So the smartphone is also contributing to the dizzying speed of change we're seeing in our world today. It was Gordon Moore who in the mid-1960s, he said that the computer processing power will double roughly every 18 months. And he was right. And it's why we're on the verge of the fourth industrial revolution, automation and robotics and 3D printing and nanotechnology that is changing the world as we know it. It took the telephone 75 years to reach 50 million users. Angry Birds did that in 35 days, right? So it's a different world we're living in today. So the smartphone in your pocket, of course, is not just a device, for you to play Angry Birds. It's also for many people, it's their first bank account, their first introduction to banking. It's a great leveler. For many people, it's their first private television set. It's also a geopolitical disruptor. In so many ways, we saw how the smartphone played a prominent role in the Arab uprisings. So in short, the smartphone has changed the way we consume, how we connect, how we produce, how we learn, how we engage in politics, how we travel, and how we live. And nowhere has this been more transformational than in the emerging markets, in the 85% of the world that lives outside of Northern America and Europe. And nowhere has this been more transformational than in China and India. So I'm delighted to welcome Ravi Agrawal here. In the book, India Connected, he notes the internet-enabled smartphone represents the greatest national upheaval since partition in 1947. Ravi is a child of India. He knows this story well. He grew up in India. He speaks Hindi, Urdu, Bengali. He studied here in the United States, and then he returned to India in 2014 as the South Asia bureau chief for CNN. And just as India was getting connected at the time. So Ravi will speak to us for about 25 minutes or so, laying out the key themes of this book, and then we'll have a broader conversation. So Ravi, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Well, hi, everyone. And thanks, Afshin, for that very, very generous introduction. Thank you all for coming. I know it's finals week here at SAIS, so for those of you who are students, I promise to give you maybe something to put in your final term papers. But really, it's a pleasure to be here. I've actually never been to SAIS before, so it's a real honor to come here and get to speak to you all in this capacity. So the book, India Connected, oops, there you go, I've just messed up the cover. The subtitle is How the Smartphone is Transforming the World's Largest Democracy. And the reason why I've framed it as such is because the smartphone truly is one of those things that has been a game changer in India and in many parts of the world. And let me explain how. So let's just do a quick show of hands here. How many of you here in this room discovered the internet, so the first time you used the internet on a PC and a dial-up connection? Is there anyone who discovered the internet on a smartphone? Not a single one of you. There you go. Can I ask where you grew up? Okay, then this is probably a function of how old you are, and I'm not going to get into this. This is where I'm going to stop asking questions. But, India's story is very different from the story that we're seeing in this room. And when I was on book tour in India, I would often ask people when they discovered the internet. And in most cases, it was in the last 2 or 3 years on a smartphone. Why is that the case? So let me take you back to the year 1999 or the year 2000. And in that year, only 2% of Indians had access to PCs, and only about 2 to 3% of Indians had telephone landlines. You put those two things together, and you have about 2% of Indians who could possibly get online using dial-up internet connections. At that same time, in the year 2000, 50% of Americans were on the internet, again, on dial-up connections on PCs. That imbalance, 2%, 50%, it would have likely continued as a giant imbalance for the next 15, 20, 30, 40 years. Because not much else has changed in India. India is a big, fast, rising economy. But in terms of GDP per capita, if you look at the size of the US economy in 2000 and the size of the Indian economy, India hasn't really caught up. India is still a very poor country. Average income in India is still about $1,800 a year. That's it. Here, it's closer to $50,000+ a year. So what's changed? Well, in the last 3 or 4 years, with the smartphone revolution in India, with cheap smartphones and very cheap data plans becoming very accessible across the country, we're now at the stage where 3 Indians are discovering the internet every second. Hundreds of millions of Indians are coming online in a way that simply was unfathomable in the India that I grew up in the 90s and the early 2000s. Look at it this way again. So all of you who just told me that you discovered the internet on a PC and a dial-up connection, you evolved with the internet. You went from there to cable and then DSL and then broadband, and then you installed routers at home and in your colleges, and then you had Wi-Fi and then your laptops, and you would walk around with that, and you began to know what it's like to move with the internet and computing, and then you got phones. Eventually you got 3G on those phones, and now you all have 4G. Within a couple of years you'll have 5G. It sounds like it all happened very quickly, but this was an evolution, really. You went through an evolutionary set of stages. In India, only the top 2, 3, 4% have been through that evolution. For the rest of the country, it is a revolution. This is not an evolution. Hundreds of millions of people discovering the internet in a very short space of time has never happened anywhere else in the world at this scale. Even China has a different story, because the Chinese were getting rich before they got online. So many Chinese were discovering the internet on PCs before their smartphone boom really took off. So in a sense, the Indian story is almost unique as far as scale is concerned. India's story is similar to other countries around it, so other South Asian countries, several African countries, but there's no other place in the world of the scope, scale, size of India's that is going through this giant smartphone revolution. Again, that is powered by very cheap phones and very cheap data plans. How many of you here have iPhones? Wow. Wow. That's a higher ratio than I usually encounter, even at talks like this in America. So that's about 75%, I would say. So an iPhone costs around about $1,000 in the United States right now. In India, it costs about $1,200 to $1,300 because of import duties. Now you can imagine if the average income in India is $1,800 a year, $1,200, $1,300 for a phone, it's not going to happen. So how are these Indians buying smartphones? They're buying Chinese-made phones, Indian-made phones, phones that cost between $50 and $200. And these are very good phones. They're not as sophisticated as maybe the latest Apple phone is or the latest Samsung phone is, but they're pretty darn good. Not only that, for most Indians, these phones, as Afshan alluded to, is their first TV, it is their first private device, it is their first video screening device, it is their first streaming device, their first Walkman, their first MP3 player, their first camera. There's a reason why India has the most deaths by selfie in the world. It's because Indians aren't sensitized to taking pictures of themselves. And this is a fact and something that we'll get to, but India has many problems that it's going to have to deal with because of all of these firsts that people are discovering in a very short space of time. There's an analogy I often refer to in the book, and it's a thread that runs through the book. The analogy is of the car and the United States of America. So let me take you back 100 years ago to when America had invented the car, and then Henry Ford built the Ford Model T, which was a cheaper car designed for the masses. It had a higher clearance so that farmers could use it as well. It was a car for everyone. And when you create a car for everyone, you then need to build roads and the highways and the interstate system, and then you create tens of thousands of jobs, and then with that, you build suburbia and the picket fenced home, and you build all of those things, and now you have the commute. And you've got the long commute to work, and with that, what do you get? You get gas stations and multiplexes and the drive-in and the diner and an entire infrastructure of things that you build and create alongside the car. And that's just physical infrastructure. There's a lot of cultural and imaginative infrastructure that was built alongside the car. I mean, I remember growing up in India with Hollywood movies, and the car was enshrined in Hollywood movies. I mean, the car was behind the bank heist and the chase and the race, and the car is where everyone had their first kiss. The car was freedom. The car, in many ways, symbolized the American dream. The car was literally mobility for a generation, maybe two generations of Americans. You take all of those things together, all of those things I just said about the car and America, another big, chaotic democracy, and you transpose it to India, and you ask the same set of questions. So you have a smartphone, and what kind of infrastructure will the smartphone build for Indians? In terms of both the physical infrastructure of a digital ecosystem, of e-commerce, of a way to date, a way to look for jobs, a way to have a better education, so on and so forth, but also the imaginative infrastructure in India in terms of the aspirations of people, in terms of how people dream, in terms of the hopes that people have. And you look at all of those things, and it really is a very similar comparison, and at similar stages of the growths of these two big, boisterous democracies, the two biggest democracies in the world. And in that sense, the smartphone really could end up being the thing that equalizes, that levels India in a way that we hadn't imagined even 5, 10 years ago. In the same way that you can look at the car someone is driving, a pickup truck or a sedan or a convertible or an SUV, you can size them up. You know who they are based on their car. You know if they have a family or if they're suburban or if they have a two-door car, they don't have a large family, so on and so forth. The phone says the same set of things about Indians today. You know that an Indian with an iPhone is likely extremely rich. You know that an Indian with, a bling pink cover with Bollywood stars on it is likely a Bollywood fan, or you can tell things about people. And the reason why I'm going there is that the phone defines young Indians today. It has become a way for Indians to identify themselves, a way for them to sort of infuse who they are and their dreams and aspirations through this one small device. The other theme that I want to bring up before we start discussing, and I'd love to open this up and get your questions as well, but the other theme that runs through my book is the notion of trust. And the reason why I use this notion of trust throughout the book is that Frank Fukuyama had this great book called Trust, in which he divided the world up into high-trust societies and low-trust societies. High-trust societies are like Germany or South Korea, where things just work, systems work, people show up on time, etc. Big conglomerates have clear supply chains that work well. Low-trust societies, in his book, he gave the example of Taiwan, which is not true anymore, and southern Italy. Sicily, for example, where businesses are mostly smaller, family-run, low trust, you trust people within your tribe or community, so on and so forth, no big companies. So he doesn't mention India, but India, for me, is clearly a low-trust society. People never show up on time for meetings. If any of you are Indian here, you'll be very familiar with that. Indians don't trust systems in very classic ways. So, for example, all of you use Uber, I take it? Every single person here. Have any of you ever paid for an Uber ride in cash? You have. Where? Wow. So in India, 70% of Uber rides are paid for in cash. And the reason is that Indians just don't trust credit cards. They don't believe that the banking system is not going to fleece them in some sort of way. So they're still tethered to the old ways. Eventually, they're going to skip the credit card system and go straight to digital, but that's going to take some time. I'll give you another example of low trust in India. So you all know what dual SIM phones are and single SIM phones. Does anyone have a dual SIM phone here? Everyone has a single SIM phone. What about our cellular connections? Does anyone here have a pay-as-you-go cellular connection? Not a single person. Everyone's on a postpaid monthly connection. So if I were to ask the same question in India, most people are on cheap pay-as-you-go systems, and they are on dual SIM systems on their phones. And there are reasons for this. It's not just because that's the way the market turned out to be. The reasons are dual SIM because you use two SIM cards. You have one with, say, Geo and one with, say, Airtel, and you toggle between them because Airtel might work today and Geo might work tomorrow. And you've got to get by, so you switch between them. Or there might be a cheap offer on Vodafone, and you want to slot one of those SIM cards in while you still use data from Geo, for example. Why do Indians use prepaid connections? Well, there's another simple reason there, because they don't trust big companies. One might work today, it might not work tomorrow. Big companies don't trust Indians either. They might not have good credit to pay off all those phone calls that they've made. So it's a two-way system of a lack of trust. And you'll see this in every single thing you encounter in Indian business and the way in which India is growing. There's a lack of systemic trust. This will change. It usually changes for economies as they become more industrialized, as they advance, as they become richer, as systems are built, and as infrastructure improves, trust is built. People show up on time. Things work. That's going to happen in India too. It's going to be one of the big trends of the 21st century, this growth in trust in places like India and in Africa, of course. The smartphone is going to play an important role here because it's going to build that trust. It's going to be a catalyst that will speed up the creation of that trust. And that's an important thing to watch out for. Some quick closing thoughts before we move on. So far, everything I've told you about the smartphone is good. You all know that that's not the case. So you've probably been sitting here wondering, going, this guy's crazy, smartphones can be terrible. And they can be, except India's not at that stage yet. India is still at the stage where there's immense excitement about this one device that is going to unify people, that is going to allow people who don't speak English, which is 1.1 billion Indians, to be able to use the internet through multilingual software. India also has 273 million illiterate Indians who can now speak to their phone. The first character in my book, she shows the phone to a bunch of rural illiterate women and says, speak to it, ask it something. And they speak in Hindi and they say the words, Mujhe Taj Mahal dikhao, which means show me the Taj Mahal, and a video pops up. And they click play and they, for the first time in their lives, see moving imagery of India's greatest monument. So there's some very powerful things that will happen in India because of the proliferation of the smartphone. And that's why this is still an optimistic story, even though here in the West, you've begun to become a little bit more jaded about technology. But the thing to look out for, and I get to this at the back of my book, is that all of the problems in the West will eventually reach India, unless India finds ways to deal with them. So fake news will be a problem in India than it is here. Pornography, well, there's an explosion in pornography in India that's going to have a range of societal impacts. Addictions are going to be even worse in India than they are here because people don't know how to deal with them. Suicides, that's going to get pretty bad too. But before I scare you all, I'll close with this. India, net, is a country that we should be optimistic about. It is young, it is hungry, it is a country that has a workforce that is very determined to aspire to more and to do more and to achieve things. And this tool, for many, is a way to do that. And for many, this is something that is giving them things that they wouldn't have otherwise had. That's something to be optimistic about. And I think for those of us who can, those of us in civil society, those of us in government, it's important to empower that optimism with ways in which to deal with the negative effects. So I'll leave it there for now. Welcome Afshin back on. Thank you very much for having me again. Okay, cheers.
Thank you. Please have a seat. Thanks, Ravi. So, one of the things that I really enjoyed about your book is the characters you brought us. And I think one of the great characters in the book was Abdul Wahid of IIP. Yeah. Maybe you can tell folks about Abdul Wahid and IIP, because he seemed to me emblematic of the aspirations of this smartphone generation?
Yeah, so Abdul Wahid is a guy who runs a coaching institute in India. So he teaches young students of physics, chemistry, biology. He coaches them into getting into medical school and engineering school. And it says a lot that India needs this system where you take a year between school and college to get into college because your schools are failing you. I mean, they're just, the school system isn't good enough. So Abdul Wahid was this guy who runs a coaching institute in Rajasthan. And I just found him to be a fascinating fixer-upper of a character, in many ways emblematic of the new fixer-upper India. And you know, this is a guy who himself never went to medical school, yet is training India's next generation of medical students. He didn't even go to college. He learned English on his smartphone. There's an app called Hello English, and he used it every day for hours and hours and hours and hours, and began to learn how to speak English. And with that, he would impress parents of students and get them to pay a lot of money to have their students join his coaching institute. And it struck me, and I was very sympathetic to him as well, because I felt for him. He grew up poor, and he was passionate about teaching, he was passionate about English, but he just had no opportunity. And so on the one hand, the phone gave him this opportunity. It gave him language, it gave him confidence. He watched all these, you know, courses on how to speak confidently on YouTube, and you know, it was an empowering thing for him. And yet, when I showed up at his coaching institute, he had banned the phone for his students because he thought it was distracting them. So the reason why I picked him as a character is that he just struck me as this, you know, the new Indian who's so driven, and the phone is so emblematic of everything they stand for. And yet, at the same time, they're so conflicted about what it brings with it.
Right, and speaking of conflicted, you also went to the village of, I think it was Suraj, right? And the village elders in Suraj decided that girls under the age of 18 should not be allowed to use the smartphone, right? And then news broke of this in India, and maybe you can tell that story and what happened there as well.
Yeah, I mean, you know, one of the great obstacles to getting people online in India is men. You know, when I moved to India in 2014, the stats were just so dire, and it's still dire. 70% of the Indian online population is male. In villages, 90% male. So that means only 10% of women in rural India, which is most of India, are online. And that's just a shocking, crazy statistic. And a lot of this is because of poverty and illiteracy and opportunity. But as I discovered in this village called Suraj, which is in the state of Gujarat, which is where the Prime Minister Narendra Modi is from, there was a village leader who had just banned the phone, blanket ban on the phone, both feature cellular phone and smartphone for girls under the age of 18. And you know, initially he denied it when I spoke to him, but when I pushed harder and I spoke to other people in the village, I learned that, I mean, A, these guys were incredibly sexist and misogynist, but B, they had a fear of the phone, where they also thought that if girls would get the phone, they would date men in other villages and then they'd run away. And there was good cause for them to want to run away, because you know, these men were just, they would beat their wives, the wives would always stay at home, they'd end up doing all the work, the men were mostly alcoholics in this village, even though it was technically a dry state, so alcohol was illegal, but it was flowing. And that village in many ways encapsulated India, because, you know, on the one hand, India is such a positive, optimistic story, and yet some of its greatest obstacles are within. Its attitudes, its people, its men.
Right, and you mentioned that getting the next 300 million Indians, the Indian middle class, online is going to be transformational. But what about the next 400 million rural Indian women? Is that, I mean, is that even, are people talking about that? Is that possible to get them online in the next decade?
They are talking about it a lot. So to quickly run through the numbers, India has about 1.3 billion people. About 500 million are currently online. That leaves 800 million not online. Google and a lot of tech companies, the government, they all know that in the next few years they can get the middle classes online. So the next 300 million. That leaves the back end of another 400 million. I'm excluding babies and children from this. But those people, and they call it sort of the final frontier of the internet in India, they're all rural women. And it's, on the one hand, getting them online, the challenges are the ones that we know of, which are illiteracy and lack of opportunity and poverty. And technology is beginning to paper over some of those problems, most powerfully because rural illiterate women can now speak to their phones. And, of all the things I saw in India, that was one of the most powerful things that struck me, that you could be a Bengali speaker or a Tamil speaker or a Hindi speaker, and you can't read or write anything, but you can speak to a phone. And there are mothers who are now using that to be able to find videos to teach their children the alphabet, to find videos to learn how to cook different things. Some of them run these sort of stitching businesses at home. Now they can pick up new designs so that they can stay ahead of the curve. A lot of that stuff is hard to quantify, but it's a big deal for India.
And Ravi, to the middle class and also that rural community, you've got still a very young population. You've got 1 million Indians roughly turning 18 every month, right?
Yeah.
And as you noted, they're entering the workforce, and in this age of automation, where the manufacturing jobs are not going to come the way they were before. I mean, do you think e-commerce can step in and fill that gap?
So there's a lot of research on this on both sides of the equation. And, obviously there are great fears here, as you're all aware of automation and how jobs will be taken away by digitization and automation. And India is going through a similar debate. But there's one bright spot in the next few years, and that bright spot is that as India's e-commerce market grows, and I should make clear, it has a long ways to grow. The size of the annual e-commerce market in India is about $25 to $30 billion a year in spend. That's how much you guys spent in one day on Cyber Friday. That's how much the Chinese spent in one day on 11/11, their Singles Day, November the 11th, when they go on their big shopping spree. So that gives you a sense of how much e-commerce can grow in India. And given that that's how much it can grow, what's going to happen? India is going to have to create jobs in delivery, in warehousing, in packing. And those jobs are going to explode. And there's some research suggesting that creation of jobs will fill 30 to 40 to 50% of the job gap in India, which is a very positive development. And then you also have the gig economy, and you have Uber's created 500,000 jobs in India. Ola, its Indian competitor, has created 1 million driver jobs in India. So, there's a lot of churn going on. The problems will arise a few years after that, when India begins to move up the economic food chain, and it needs a higher level of service job, and India is not creating those.
Right. And so, I'm gonna open it to all of you. Just last couple questions. When you look at the top 5 smartphone brands in India, right? Number 1, Xiaomi, with about almost 30% of the market. Number 2, Samsung. Number 3, Vivo. Number 4, Vivo has 12.6%. Oppo has 7.6%. Transsion has 5%. If you're counting, that means 4 of the top 5 brands are Chinese, with almost 55% of the market, right? Is there any discussion about this in Indian, political circles, given, the sometimes rocky geopolitical relationship between India and China?
There's not enough discussion. And the reason is that there's this pull and push tension between the data you've just cited. So on the one hand, you have the Chinese who are able to create these phones for cheap because of large scale, their ability to manufacture them and then send them to India for cheap, right? So, and which is fueling India's internet boom, right? So without very cheap phones, and these are the cheapest ones, without them, Indians wouldn't be getting online the way they are. So that's the good news. The bad news, of course, is that this opens up the security and data space in a way that could be very dangerous. You've been following the Huawei story and, how there are fears that the closeness of Huawei executives to the Chinese state means that maybe there could be data leakages or data sharing with the Chinese state. There are similar fears with other Chinese phone makers as well, because it's China and the state can interfere. India now has fears about data. It has begun to ask smartphone makers, in some cases, to house their data on consumers within the country or within the country's clouds, as it were. And that's a fight. It's a fight that's still taking place. I mean, this really is the Wild West, and I don't think India's even close to figuring it out.
Okay. Just lastly, you've been on book tour for what, 2 months now? About?
Yeah.
2.5. Okay. And you started in India, which was interesting. And congratulations, by the way. Ravi's book is a bestseller in India. And what has surprised you the most? In fact, you and I were talking beforehand, and you mentioned there was a lot of fascination with your interview with Sunny Leone. Maybe you can tell the group about that.
So how many of you know who Sunny Leone is? 4 or 5 hands up.
Okay.
So she is the most Googled person in India, year after year, every year, since 2011. More than Narendra Modi, more than Priyanka Chopra, more than, name your famous Indian, she dwarfs everyone in terms of people Googling her. And Sunny Leone isn't her real name, but if you Google it, you'll quickly see Sunny Leone is a former porn star who is now an actress and sort of brand kind of icon in India. But really, she made her name by being a porn star in Canada and here in America, and then moved to India. And this is something that clearly, through Google, as we know, is a source of unending fascination in India, and says so much about India that on the one hand, Indians are so starved for sex, and the first thing many Indians who get online tend to search for is pornography. And this is quite normal because it explains a lot about where India is, in that there was no other way to search for porn or to search for any form of sex and sexuality. There's a whole raft of things that could go wrong with the way Indians are discovering sex. And we can get into that, but violent rape is among them. But on the other side, there's a very interesting notion as well that we all see India as this conservative, prudish society, and yet, its people really have embraced Sunny Leone as one of their own. She's Indian origin, but she's Canadian-American. And, she's become one of their top stars in Bollywood and across the board. And that also speaks to a changing, young, rising India with different, newer attitudes, in a way hearkening back to the old India, because after all, before colonization, India was not as prudish as it is today. If you think of many of the things that introduced prudishness to India, from the bra to the petticoat to the blouse, these are all Victorian imports. They're not Indian inherently or innately or historically Indian things. So anyway, it'll be interesting to see what you guys want to ask, but usually in India, porn tends to be the first thing that comes up from the audience. Dating and marriage, so dating apps, everyone wants to talk about that in India. And fake news, that's an issue of immense and growing concern in India, more so than it is here. I realize here it can swing an election, but in India, it can lead to mob violence and lynching. So very serious stuff that is really an issue of concern.
Great, thank you. So now I want to open it up to all of you. Your thoughts, questions, please. Oh, there's a microphone there. Yeah.
Thank you. Wow, I'm very loud now. I just wanted to know about how dating apps, I know Badoo is one of them and there's several others, how that's changing the landscape of dating and how generationally that's affecting dating, because I feel like it must be pretty difficult to reconcile different generations' ideas of how you should date.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a whole chapter on dating and marriage. So there's Tinder in India, of course, which is very well known. But the problem with Tinder in India is that it's seen as being more of a hookup app, which is harder for Indians to digest. So the company that I profile in my chapter on dating and marriage is a company called Truly Madly. And if you're wondering, it's named after the song, Truly Madly Deeply, a very cheesy founder. And what they did with Truly Madly is they wanted to Indianize dating. And so it's not about marriage, but it's not about sex. It's about dating. And they, as I was saying earlier, India is such a low trust society, so they build trust. So they seek several forms of ID, from passport to driver's license to school ID or work forms or something. And then if they find out that you're married or something, they'll kick you off. So they don't like affairs. They want to keep it very clean. And what's interesting is if you look at the data of who's using Truly Madly, it is mostly an 18 to 24 age group, not much older. It is mostly smaller cities, so it's very aspirational. It's not a big city thing because in big cities you can date already in most cases. So it really is something that is, if you look at the people who are using it, they are essentially trying to test the waters. It's not easy to date if you grow up in Surat or Lucknow or Patna or any of these tier 2 or tier 3 Indian cities as they're known. And this allows Indians to date in a way that is virtual, so they're able to text and chat and flirt in a way that isn't possible at school or at home. It sensitizes them to the opposite sex in a way that isn't possible normally. It also allows them to do all of this in private, which is very hard to do in India in general for anything. Indian notions of privacy are very different from Western notions of privacy. So for all of those reasons, I think the phone and dating apps are really important for a younger generation of Indians. However, many of them may still end up going for arranged marriages. 70 to 80% of Indians have arranged marriages. And there's nothing wrong with that. You see, as I discovered when I was researching that particular chapter, as much as tech will change India, India will also change tech. So a lot of young Indians who found matches on Truly Madly and other dating apps, sometimes some of the first things they'd ask was, what's your caste? Or, I'm Punjabi, are you Punjabi? I just want to make sure. What's your star sign? So Indians love to match astrological charts. They might keep doing that. In fact, there's an astrological app called Ask Monk, which has millions of users in India and is growing so rapidly. So, this notion that the smartphone will necessarily make India more Western, I don't think is a correct notion. And I went in with that notion, and I think I convinced myself otherwise at the end of my 3.5 years there.
Ravi, you mentioned identification. Where are we now on the biometric identification program known as Aadhaar? And maybe you can tell some folks who may not know about it. It's an extraordinary thing to categorize 1 billion people with biometric identification and some of the controversy around it.
Yeah, so all of you have social security cards or driver's licenses. You have a form of ID that essentially says, I am me. Most Indians have never had that form of ID, and so a few years ago, India started its biometric ID system with retinal scans and fingerprints and names and addresses and phone numbers, and managed to sign up 1.2 billion Indians over the course of 3 or 4 years, which really is a remarkable feat in and of itself. However, now that it's done so, while there's a lot of good that could come with this, which is direct bank subsidies, subsidies for food and gas and basic identification, opening a bank account, all of these things now are becoming much easier in India than they were in the past. So there's a lot of good stuff that is happening because of Aadhaar, as it's known. But there's some bad stuff as well. There have been leakages in the system. There's a lot of criticism of how the government is handling those leakages and not being open about them, not defending it enough. There's also a lot of criticism about the overreach of the state and how the government is trying to link that ID to other things, so making it necessary to have an ID to get a bank account or a phone account, which really is something that civil society in India is pushing back against. But I'll say one thing that is not part of the Indian discourse yet, and it's more of the discourse here, which is the data wars of the future. And all of you know that in the next 20, 30 years, whoever really controls our data is going to control, us in many ways. And, data regulation is going to be this huge field in the future in terms of who gets to own our data, can we sell our data, so on and so forth. The one thing India has going for it with Aadhaar is that Aadhaar is dumb data. So it's just basically your address, your phone number, your fingerprints, which is important because you can't change it if someone steals your fingerprints. But it's dumb data in that it's not like it has your browsing history. It's not like it knows every single thing you've purchased in the last 10 years. It's not like it can be used to advertise stuff to you in a way that we know Facebook and Google have done here. So in that sense, India, in having created this government system, may have inoculated itself from some of the problems that the West will and is encountering. And that said, India, of course, is also diving headlong into using Facebook and Google and WhatsApp and all of these things. Remember, Facebook has more users in India than anywhere else in the world. WhatsApp has more users in India than anywhere else in the world. So, a lot of these problems will come up in India too.
Right. Please. Please. I think the microphone is coming up to you so we can.
About 15 to 18 years ago, we were hopeful that the advent of the internet will help spread civil society, democracy, but unfortunately, we've learned otherwise. India, what are your thoughts with the mobile phone? How will that impact the democracy in India? Will it shape it into becoming more efficient, or will it go the route of China, which I, unfortunately, personally, I'm very concerned that maybe big data makes dictatorships feasible, because up to now, beyond a certain state, it would be very hard to manage a dictatorship. But big data, especially with what China is doing with their social credit system, I was wondering what would be your thoughts in general?
Those are two great questions. So I'll begin with the notion of the phone changing India. And, every few hundred years, something has come around where people say, this is going to fix India, or this is going to end the caste system, or this is going to make India an equal society. Karl Marx said that the railways are going to end the caste system in India. That didn't happen. Electricity was supposed to make India a uniformly modern society. That didn't happen. Cable TV was supposed to bring the world to all Indians, and it did to some extent for the upper middle classes, but again, not for everyone. The reason why I think the smartphone is different to all of this is that it is mobile, it is portable, it is small, it is very cheap. Jio, for example, which is the Reliance company, is currently leasing out Jio phones for $23 for 3 years, and at the end of those 3 years, you get your $23 back. Now we're talking about sums of money that really will make a difference in India. Not only that, this is not just a phone. It's an everything device. It's your camera, it's your TV, it's your, if you're going to get one thing this year in India, it's going to be a smartphone. So no matter how poor you are, you will find a way to get a phone, a $23 phone if needs be, but you will find a way to do it, or it'll be a hand-me-down. So I do think this is more transformative than anything else. Certainly things that were run by the government. So this is a private sector story. Electricity was a government story. The railways was a government story. TV was also a government story. And we know that the government in India has largely been inept at getting things to everyone. This is different. It will come with many, many problems, so let's get into that. Comparison with China is quite apt, but different. And I think China is more monolithic than India is. It has one language. In India, the language that most people speak is Hindi, and that's only about 400 to 500 million. English is about 200 million. Bengali is maybe 100 million. So, and then it fractures even more from there to smaller numbers of people speaking languages. It's hard for any one political party, for any one person, for any one company to truly rule India in any way that we've seen in China. The Chinese internet ecosystem is really an ecosystem where you get onto Weibo and you can chat, you can order a taxi, you can do everything inside this one ecosystem. India doesn't have those kinds of ecosystems. India has Uber, it has Ola, it also has Facebook and Google, and now Jio is trying to create its own ecosystem, but there's too much competition. So I'm not as worried as you are about India heading China's way, but I am worried about India heading the West's way. So I think there will be the same things, the hope that we had of the internet making conversations freer and fairer, may backfire in India, where we may have more echo chambers. We may have more, confirmation bias. We may have more conversations that go viral and take away from, more substantial conversations that need to be taking place. So those are the things that India needs to watch out for. I think India's story is more of a Western internet story than a Chinese internet story.
More fake news too, right? And
fake news.
And that has already, injected itself into Indian politics, right?
It really has.
Yeah.
It is so easy for fake news to enter the Indian WhatsApp ecosystem and then spread like wildfire. There are videos that routinely surface, the same ones again and again, of, say, for example, what looks like a Muslim man burning a Hindu woman. Of course, it happens to be Guatemalan, but that doesn't matter. It'll just, forward like wildfire on WhatsApp, and then it spurs violence because a group of Hindus will get very emotional and say, well, we must, go attack these Muslim men because, they've come after our women. And so in some senses, fake news and the phone are amplifying pre-existing social conflicts and social fears. And, it's really anyone's guess as to how India is going to deal with that, but it's going to be a big problem, especially going into 2019 when India has its national elections coming up.
Please. Next one. All right. I have one while you're thinking. To Reza's point about the India-China comparison, companies, right? So you mentioned the Chinese tech ecosystem. You've got companies like Baidu and Alibaba and Tencent, which are global companies with serious market capitalizations, right? You don't have that similar ecosystem in India with those kind of companies with that kind of muscle, right? And part of it is because Amazon was allowed to enter and Uber was allowed to enter. And when you're going head to head with Amazon or Uber, it's a matter of how much cash can you burn, right? But China closed its internet market in many ways to those companies, and therefore the Baidus and the Alibabas and the Tencents were able to grow.
Yeah.
Not saying that they're not dynamic companies, many of them are, but what is the talk in India about the Amazons of the world, about the Ubers of the world? Because we know the companies like Flipkart, which is an e-commerce player in India, are really facing a tough time facing off against Amazon that has pledged to spend $5 billion in India.
Yeah, and funnily enough, Walmart just invested, I think it's what, $14 billion in Flipkart.
In Flipkart.
So Walmart is now competing against Amazon in India.
Well, that's
India is the new battleground for Western companies
right.
and Western investors. I think this is both good and bad. I think there are two reasons why the West came in a big way into the Indian internet story. I think one is English. And the fact that 200 million Indians spoke English, and these were the 200 million Indians who were the first ones to get online. They tend to be richer, they tend to be more urban, they tend to be bigger consumers. So, if you are a Western investor, why not target them? So that's one reason. The second reason is that when the internet was taking off, so late 90s, early 2000s, China was at a different stage of development. China's stage of development was more middle income, where its average income per capita was in the $6,000, $7,000 a year range. Now it's in the $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 a year range. India in those days was at the $1,000 a year range, maybe less, like $700, $800 a year. So that market was just nowhere near big enough, even for Western companies to target, let alone for Indian companies to target. Like there just wasn't scale, there wasn't consumer power to take in any investment, even from the Indian side. That's what's beginning to change. So there's really a confluence of events that's taking place right now in India, which makes this story exciting. And that is the rise of the Indian middle class, fewer people in poverty, so more people who are moving into the middle class with the ability to spend. You have the rise of big Indian companies at the higher end, so the likes of Reliance and Indian companies like Bharti that are able to invest in a big way in that space. You have globalization, so the ability for China and other companies to flood the Indian market with cheap phones. And then you have smartphone and cellular technology being at the stage where it is, that you can present this ready-made, all-in-one, everything device to Indians. You know, here's your camera, here's your phone, here's your computer, all in this one $23 device for 3 years. It's irresistible.
Right.
And if it weren't for all of these things together, a real confluence of events, this wouldn't be happening in India right now.
Okay, so we're going to be wrapping up soon, and let's see, over here and then over here. Why don't we take these two together? And then Ravi's going to be here to sign some books for you. They make great stocking stuffers. I think they may even fit in a stocking.
If you stuff it, really.
Yeah.
Thank you. What's your observation been about access to justice and the way that's been affected in India by the smartphone? And what I mean is that you were comparing earlier India's smartphone story to the West. In the United States, for example, there's been issues around police forces abusing their power and so on, but with those cameras on smartphones now, evidence of that is becoming a lot more commonplace, and the issue has become a lot more talked about, just because the evidence is so undeniable. How does this compare to what's happened so far in India, and where do you see it going?
Why don't we take that question over here, and we'll take them together.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on India's perception of the Western culture? Because I know a lot of youth might see like things happening like in the West on social media, on Facebook, and they tend to kind of like, I think, lose their Indian culture because they perceive, I think they try to be more like American than actual Americans, because and they think it's not cool to be Indian. And like, I think a lot of the population in India right now itself also like doesn't know Sanskrit and things like that. So they're kind of losing the culture kind of steadily because they think that it's cooler to be less Indian. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, those are great questions.
In any order.
So I'll start with the justice question. I mean, this is still, an ongoing story, but I do know that, for example, when it comes to sexual violence, women have been quite clear that having a camera in their hand, having an ability to make a phone call, or having the ability to even track their journey in Uber and share it with a friend ahead of time, it allows them to go to work in ways that would have been impossible in India, especially late at night. So those are some sort of preventative kind of ways in which the phone has been a big tool for advancement in India. You look at the Me Too movement in India, it is entirely a social media movement where it is only because, it's not like Ronan Farrow and Jane Meyer were in India uncovering, bringing down big names in media and politics. Journalism failed India in that sense. The reason why India's Me Too movement took off is because some very brave women took to Twitter and just, essentially outed the people who had molested them or harassed them at work in a public way that was empowering and freeing, and then opened it up to other women joining in, and also, coming together in an amazing, remarkable way that entirely happened through social media and would not have happened without it. So those are just some examples of ways in which, this is sort of kind of playing out in India. And it's not a clean sort of way, in the way in which it's playing out, but it certainly is empowering for people in ways that wasn't possible maybe 5 years ago. And then to your question about being cool to be Western, that's true to some extent. It has long been the case. I don't think this is new. I think, even 100 years ago, if an Indian was able to speak English, that was cool. Speaking English meant you were a white-collar worker. It meant you were higher up in society. So there's always been that, always as in for the last 500 years, there's been this notion that being more worldly or Western will get you a better job, will place you higher up in society, so on and so forth. So I don't think the phone is anything new in that sense. If anything, I would almost argue that the phone is allowing younger Indians to express themselves using the jargon of the West, but in an Indian way. So the big Ambani wedding this past weekend where, this basically Asia's richest man's daughter got married in Mumbai, and Hillary Clinton was there, and Beyonce flew in for a 45-minute performance. And if you look at the way Indian internet has been talking about it, they've been talking about it in a very Indian way, and in a way that is celebrating Indian culture and Bhangra and Indian dance and the notion of the Sangeet as the day of song and dance before the wedding, and a lot of this is through social media again. So, I understand where you're coming from, and I also sometimes feel the same way, that India is becoming more westernized, and there are fewer people who can speak Sanskrit, and the Indian language arts are not championed as much as they should be. These are all true, but that's been a trend that's been in place for many years. Social media and the internet may even reverse some of that trend if it brings in people into the conversation who weren't part of the conversation before. So people who don't speak English who can now use WhatsApp. And not only that, there are all these Indian apps that are bringing people together. ShareChat, I don't know if you guys have heard of it. It's the new WhatsApp with about 100 million users. Hike, another Indian app where people are communicating in emoji, Indian emoji, in ways that frankly are Greek to me. But they're communicating in very Indian ways. Indians use even WhatsApp in a very Indian way. You guys all probably know that every morning Indians wake up, they send each other GIFs on WhatsApp saying good morning. And WhatsApp found out because it was clogging their servers in the morning, and they wanted to know, like, what's going on in the morning? Why are our servers suddenly clogged? And lo and behold, it was like 200 million Indians saying good morning to each other. So, which is a very Indian thing to do. So again, I'll close by saying, as much as tech will change India, India will change tech.
Yeah. Wasn't there 14 billion messages, I think, on New Year's Eve on WhatsApp? I think you mentioned. Yeah. Let me just, since we're at Johns Hopkins sites, let me take the liberty to, the premier graduate school of international affairs, of course. So let me take the liberty to ask you about Narendra Modi.
I'll put my foreign policy hat on.
Yes, put your foreign policy hat on for a moment. It looks like he lost a regional election. Grade Narendra Modi thus far, if you will, and tell us if you think he will remain as, will he win the next election as well?
Wow, big one.
Yeah.
We're not filming this, are we? So you all know who Modi is. He swept to power in 2014 as Prime Minister. He's the leader of the BJP, which is a right-wing Hindu, pro-Hindu, Hindutva party in India, as opposed to the Congress, which is seen as more secular and was, the oldest Indian party in that it led the freedom fighters movement, so on and so forth. India, for the last 20, 30 years, has mostly had coalition governments, simply because it's so fractured. Every state has its own party. Sometimes people vote on, there's the famous line in India, you don't cast your vote, you vote your caste. It's true. And so it's very rare for one party to come to power without needing other coalition partners. That was the BJP in 2014. So Modi came to power with this tremendous mandate. He, in a very seductive way, on the campaign trail in 2014, he promised a smartphone in every hand. He promised mass infrastructure projects, bridges, roads, promised job creation. He started, with great fanfare, all of these very catchy movements: Digital India, Make in India, Clean India, and there are a dozen different names of these initiatives that he started. The guy is a marketing genius, just really knows how to sell an aspirational notion of India. Problem is, when you raise expectations, people actually want some returns. And, all the signs point to 4 years on, the economy hasn't really taken off. There are no giant infrastructure projects to speak of, lots of small stuff, but nothing big. Job creation, net zero over the course of 4 years. There's been a lot of foreign direct investment. Modi's been great at drumming up support. He's been a strong foreign policy prime minister. He's been very tough on terror. He has begun to be less non-aligned as many previous Indian prime ministers were, and we're entering an era now where India will begin to be a little bit more aligned, a little bit more assertive in terms of what it wants regionally, but also globally. So there's a lot of all of those different things happening at the same time. But the truth is that, as it is here, it's the economy is stupid. And so, this past week, 5 major Indian states went to elections. These are state-level elections for state governments. The BJP lost several of those states. It lost many seats, including in the Hindi heartland, which has long been its great constituency. So Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Rajasthan, for those of you who know these states in India. These are all states that the BJP should have won. It lost all of them as of today. There's still some vote counting going on. But signs point to the fact that people are beginning to question the success of Modi. They're beginning to wonder whether they've been sold, a bunch of goods. And I caveat all of this by saying state elections are very different from national elections. National elections will come around next year. Those tend to be more presidential, so they will pit Modi one-on-one against another candidate, likely Rahul Gandhi. Modi polls very well, generally, in presidential-style elections. He is still overwhelmingly India's most popular prime minister, most popular leader. Approval ratings in the 70% range. Highly likely that he will win the next national election, but likely weakened. So he won't win it as a sole BJP power, but most likely it'll be a coalition government, which means the stock market will tank, and which means India will not be able to be as swift and decisive on a range of things from foreign policy to banking to economics to reforms. But that might be a good thing.
And we know there'll be more smartphone users in India.
That's not going to change.
That's right. So thank you, Ravi Agrawal, for this conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure to be here.